The winter of 1948 hit the northern plains harder than anyone in Grant County, South Dakota could remember. By mid-January, temperatures hadn't climbed above zero in 17 days. Stock tanks froze solid within hours of being chopped open. Metal tools became so brittle they'd snap like icicles, and across thousands of square miles of frozen farmland, one piece of equipment stood between survival and catastrophe: the hand pump. Every morning before dawn, Martha Henderson walked from her farmhouse to the pump in their barnyard, her breath crystallizing in the air, forming clouds that seemed to freeze mid-exhale. Her husband Tom had left 3 weeks earlier to work the lumber camps up in Minnesota, like so many farmers did during brutal winters when there was no other way to bring in cash. That left Martha, their 2 boys, and her father-in-law running a dairy operation with 37 cows that needed water twice a day, no matter how cold it got. The pump stood in the center of the barnyard, a red cast-iron monument that had been there since Tom's grandfather homesteaded the place back in 1903. It pulled water from a well 63 feet down, where the water table ran deep and cold but never quite froze. That pump was the lifeline. Without it, Martha would have to haul water in buckets from the creek a quarter-mile away, chipping through ice that grew thicker every night. With the temperature at 18 below and a wind that cut through 4 layers of clothing, that wasn't just hard work. It was dangerous. She grabbed the iron handle, worn smooth by 4 decades of use, and gave it that first experimental pump. Nothing. The handle moved, but no water came. She pumped again, harder this time, feeling the mechanism move beneath her, but hearing only the hollow sound of air moving through frozen pipes. Her stomach tightened. This was exactly what she'd been dreading. Martha's father-in-law, Clayton, emerged from the barn carrying a milk pail in each hand. At 71, he moved carefully on the ice-packed ground, but his eyes were sharp. He set down the pails and walked over to the pump, placed one weathered hand on the iron spout and nodded grimly. "Froze up," he said. It wasn't a question. "What do we do?" Martha asked, though she already knew the answer would involve more work than she wanted to think about. Clayton looked toward the house, then back at the pump, calculating something in his head. "We do what my father taught me in '09, the winter that killed half the cattle in the county. We keep this pump alive, no matter what." The technique Clayton referred to was something every old-timer in the northern states knew, though each family had their own variation. It wasn't written in any manual or taught in any agricultural school. It was pure, practical wisdom, passed down from one generation to the next, refined through trial and error during winters that tested everything a farmer thought they knew. The problem with hand pumps in extreme cold wasn't usually the well itself. 60 feet down, the water temperature stayed constant, hovering just above freezing. The issue was the vertical pipe bringing that water to the surface, and more critically, the few feet of pipe and the pump mechanism above ground, where water sat exposed to air temperatures that could plunge to 30 or 40 below zero. When water froze in those upper sections, it expanded, and if you weren't careful, it would crack the pipe or damage the pump's internal leather gaskets and valves. A cracked pump in January could mean disaster. Clayton sent Martha's older boy, Daniel, who was 14 that winter, to fetch specific items from the barn: burlap sacks, a bucket of ashes from the wood stove, an old wool blanket, and most importantly, a gallon jug of kerosene and some rags. While Daniel gathered the materials, Clayton began the first step of the process. He positioned Martha at the pump handle. "Start pumping," he instructed. "Slow and steady. Don't stop until I tell you." Martha began working the handle in a rhythmic motion. For the first dozen strokes, nothing happened. Then came a coughing, sputtering sound from deep in the pipe, air pockets escaping. She kept pumping, her shoulder beginning to burn from the effort. Suddenly, a chunk of ice shot from the spout, followed by a splatter of water that instantly began to freeze on the ground. She kept pumping, and now the water came in a steady stream, so cold it seemed to steam in the frigid air. "Keep going," Clayton said. He'd seen this countless times. The pumping motion itself generated heat through friction in the pump's mechanism, and the movement of water through the pipe prevented it from freezing solid. But that was only step one. While Martha pumped, Clayton prepared what farmers called a pump sweater. He soaked several burlap sacks in the water flowing from the pump, wrung them out partially, then wrapped them around the pump body and the exposed pipework. The wet burlap would freeze quickly, but that was the point. Once frozen, it created an insulating shell around the metal, protecting it from the even colder air. He layered the wool blanket over the burlap, then secured everything with baling wire. But the real trick, the part that separated farms where pumps survived winter from those where they didn't, came next. Clayton took the kerosene-soaked rags and carefully wrapped them around the base of the pump, where the mechanism met the ground. He didn't light them, not yet. That would come later, during the coldest part of the night. The kerosene-soaked fabric wouldn't freeze as easily as plain cloth, and when lit it would burn slowly, providing just enough heat to keep the most critical section of the pump above freezing without generating enough heat to damage the wooden pump platform or the leather gaskets inside. "Martha," Clayton said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of winter farming, "from now until this cold breaks, that pump cannot sit idle more than 4 hours, day or night. Someone has to come out here and pump until water flows clean. Then we re-wrap it. 4 hours, no more." Martha understood what he was saying. It meant someone would be setting an alarm and coming out here at 2 in the morning every single night until the weather changed. It meant no solid night's sleep, no break from the cold, no relief from the relentless demands of keeping things alive. "We can do 4-hour shifts," she said, her jaw set. "Me, you, and Daniel, we rotate." Clayton nodded. "Your boy's growing up fast. Might as well learn now what winter farming really means." That night, Martha took the first shift. She bundled herself in every piece of warm clothing she owned, wrapped a scarf around her face until only her eyes showed, and set out into darkness lit only by a kerosene lantern. The cold was so intense it made her eyes water, and the tears froze on her cheeks. The stars overhead seemed close enough to touch, brilliant and hard in the crystalline air. She carefully removed the blanket and burlap from the pump, moving quickly before the exposed metal could freeze worse than it already had. She began pumping, counting the strokes like a meditation. 1, 2, 3, 4. Her breath came in controlled measures. She could hear the ice breaking up inside the pipe, could feel through the handle the moment water began to move again. 37 strokes before water appeared. She counted them every time. The water that emerged was so cold it was almost slushy, but it flowed. She pumped for 15 minutes, until her shoulder screamed and her hand cramped even inside her heavy mittens. She checked the kerosene rags at the base, decided they didn't need lighting yet, re-wrapped the pump in its protective layers, and trudged back to the house. 4 hours later, Clayton was out there doing the same thing. Then Daniel, then Martha again. Day after day, night after night, the cycle continued. But the Henderson family's method, effective as it was, represented just one approach to the problem. Across Grant County and throughout the northern plains, hundreds of farm families were battling the same challenge, and each had their own refinements. The Nordstrom family, whose farm sat 3 miles east of the Hendersons, used a different technique passed down from their Norwegian ancestors. They kept a dedicated fire barrel positioned near their pump, feeding it throughout the night with corn cobs and wood scraps. The radiant heat from the barrel, positioned carefully upwind, kept the air temperature around the pump just warm enough to make a difference. Their son Eric spent entire nights feeding that fire, catching brief moments of sleep on a chair pulled close enough to the flames to stay barely warm. The fire barrel method required constant attention and a huge supply of fuel, but for the Nordstroms, who had acres of corn stubble and a woodlot full of deadfall, the fuel wasn't the problem. The bigger challenge was keeping the fire controlled in wind that could shift directions without warning, potentially sending sparks toward wooden barn structures. Other families used what they called the grandmother method, developed by farm women who'd learned to make do with what was available. This involved keeping a large pot of water heating continuously on the kitchen stove, then carrying that hot water out to the pump every few hours and pouring it slowly over the pump mechanism. The hot water would temporarily thaw any ice formation and allow for pumping. This method was brutally hard on whoever drew the duty, usually the farmer's wife, because it meant endless trips between hot stove and frozen barnyard, each journey a shock to the system. Women who used this method developed a particular gait, a quick shuffle that conserved heat and minimized the chance of slipping on ice while carrying scalding water. Some families developed more elaborate solutions. The Johansons built a small shed around their pump, insulated with straw bales, stacked 3 feet thick on all sides. They'd tend a small fire inside the shed during the worst cold, creating a protected environment where the pump could be worked without exposing the operator to the full force of the wind. The shed caught fire twice before they perfected the ventilation, but once they got it right, several neighbors copied the design. The kerosene rag technique had its own variations. Some farmers swore by diesel fuel instead, claiming it burned more steadily and longer. Others used rendered animal fat mixed with kerosene, creating a paste that could be molded around the base of the pump and lit as needed. Each farm refined its own approach through winters of trial and error. The Henderson family maintained their rotation for 6 brutal weeks. 6 weeks of interrupted sleep, of stumbling into frozen darkness, of pumping until muscles burned. Daniel grew gaunt and hollow-eyed, but he never missed his shift. Clayton's arthritis flared so badly his hands swelled and stiffened, but he'd be out there every 8 hours, working that handle. Martha felt like she was moving through a dream, an exhausted haze where day and night blurred into an endless cycle of cold pumping, fanned brief moments of warmth in the kitchen before the alarm clock rang again. Other families weren't so fortunate. The Carlsons, 2 miles south, made it through January, but in early February, father and son both came down with influenza. No one was well enough to maintain the pump routine. By the time they recovered enough to check it, the pump was frozen solid. The pipe cracked in 3 places. They spent the rest of the winter hauling water from a creek, a task so exhausting that they sold half their herd in March. Neighbors who discovered someone was sick would add that family's pump to their own rotation, walking the extra quarter-mile in darkness to keep another farm's lifeline alive. The winter of 1948 became legendary, not just for its severity, but for what it revealed about these communities. Teenage boys like Daniel became men that winter, learning that survival meant doing the impossible, repeatedly, without complaint. Church services were sparsely attended, not because faith wavered, but because no one could afford to leave their farms for several hours. The pump cycles couldn't wait, livestock couldn't wait. Preachers understood and made house calls instead, brief visits to read scripture and pray with families too exhausted to do much more than listen. By mid-February, Martha had lost track of how many times she'd made that walk to the barnyard in darkness. Her right shoulder ached constantly. Her hands were covered in small cuts and calluses. She'd stopped looking at herself in the mirror because the hollow-eyed woman staring back wasn't someone she recognized. Then, on the morning of February 23rd, everything changed. Martha woke to a sound she hadn't heard in 2 months, water dripping. She sat up in bed confused and realized the air felt different, warmer. She rushed to the window and saw water running from the icicles on the barn roof. A Chinook wind had blown in from the west during the night, and the temperature had climbed 40 degrees in just a few hours. She pulled on her coat and boots and ran to the barnyard. Clayton was already there, standing by the pump. Water was dripping from the spout without anyone pumping. The ice was melting. Together they unwrapped the pump, removing the burlap and blankets that had protected it through the worst. The red cast iron looked weathered and scarred, but it had done its job. It had kept them alive. Martha placed her hand on the pump handle, still cold to the touch but warming in the morning sun. She thought about the hundreds of times she'd gripped this handle in the frozen dark, pumping until her arms burned, her breath forming clouds of ice. She thought about Daniel, growing from boy to man in the span of 6 weeks. She thought about Clayton, working this same pump through winters going back decades, teaching her what his father had taught him. "We did it," she said quietly. Clayton nodded. "We did. Same as folks have been doing since pumps were invented. Same as they'll keep doing long after we're gone." That afternoon, temperatures reached 45 degrees. The thaw created its own challenges with flooding and mud, but these were manageable problems. The desperate battle was over. They washed the burlap sacks and wool blanket, folded them carefully and stored them in the barn where they'd be ready for the next time. Because there would be a next time. There always was. When Tom Henderson returned from the lumber camps in early March, He found his family exhausted but intact, his livestock healthy, his farm operational. Martha handed him a cup of coffee and simply said, "It was a hard winter." Tom looked at his son, who'd grown taller and leaner, at his father, whose hands were more gnarled than when he'd left, at his wife, whose eyes carried a weariness that hadn't been there before. He understood without asking what they'd been through. "The pump?" he asked. "Still standing," Martha said. That red pump remained in service for another 20 years, through winters mild and severe, tended by hands that knew exactly what to do when the temperature dropped and the water stopped flowing. The knowledge of how to keep it alive passed from Clayton to Martha to Daniel, each learning through doing, through nights so cold that breathing hurt and exhaustion became a constant companion. The techniques they used weren't magic. They were simple physics applied through determination. Insulation to slow heat loss, controlled fire for targeted warmth, and constant cycling to prevent stagnation. But knowing what to do and actually doing it through 6 weeks of sub-zero darkness were two different things entirely. That's what made the difference between farms that survived brutal winters and those that didn't. Not just knowledge, but the will to apply it hour after hour, shift after shift, until the weather finally broke. Thank you for watching this story about the farmers who kept their hand pumps alive through some of the harshest winters in American history. If you enjoyed learning about this piece of agricultural heritage and the determination of farm families during this era, please subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and share it with anyone who appreciates real farm wisdom from America's heartland. This video is inspired by real historical events and the genuine experiences of farming families during the 1930s through 1970s. It is not intended to represent or offend any specific individuals or families. Martha Henderson and other families mentioned are representative characters reflecting the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced similar situations during this era, using these exact techniques to survive brutal Dakota winters when a frozen pump could mean the difference between survival and disaster.